Chapter 1. The Morning Post. The morning had been particularly pleasant in St. Mary Mead. A gentle breeze carried the scent of late summer roses through the village, and Miss Jane Marple had taken advantage of the fine weather to tend to her garden. Her knees might not be what they once were, but her passion for her prized blooms remained undiminished. She was carefully trimming a particularly stubborn rosebush when the distant sound of the village postman's bicycle bell caught her attention. Mr. Polk had been delivering mail in St. Mary Mead for nearly 20 years, and his routine was as reliable as the church clock. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, pushing the garden gate open with practised ease. "Lovely day for it." "Indeed it is, Mr. Polk," she replied, slowly straightening her back and removing her gardening gloves. "Though I suspect we might see rain before the day is out." Mr. Polk glanced sceptically at the cloudless blue sky, but had long since learned not to question Miss Marple's weather predictions. "If you say so, miss. Got quite a handful for you today. The usual from your nephew in London, and something that looks rather official." He handed over the small bundle, tipped his cap, and was soon off to his next delivery, the squeak of his bicycle fading as he disappeared down the lane. Miss Marple examined the envelopes with mild interest. Raymond's letter would doubtless contain his usual affectionate inquiries, and perhaps news of his latest literary endeavours. The second letter bore the unmistakable government-issue envelope of her quarterly pension, but it was the third item that caused her eyebrows to rise slightly. The envelope was of high quality, cream-coloured with a distinctive weight to it. The address was written in an elegant flowing script that spoke of a good education. Most curious, however, was that it bore a local postmark. Miss Marple decided that whatever it contained could wait until she had enjoyed her morning tea. Some 15 minutes later, settled comfortably in her parlour with a steaming cup beside her, she carefully opened the mysterious envelope. Inside was a single sheet of the same quality paper, upon which was written, "To the residents of St. Mary Mead, you are cordially invited to attend a garden party at Gossington Hall this Saturday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The occasion shall mark both my arrival to the community and, regrettably, what may be my last social engagement. For, at precisely 4 o'clock Letitia Blackwood shall be murdered. Refreshments will be served. Yours sincerely, Letitia Blackwood." Miss Marple read the note twice, her pale blue eyes narrowing slightly. She set down her teacup with deliberate care and reached for her telephone, dialing a number she knew by heart. "Dolly? Yes, it's Jane. I've just received the most extraordinary invitation. I wonder, did you receive something similar?" Mrs. Dolly Bantry, owner of Gossington Hall until she sold it following her husband's death 3 years prior, confirmed that she had not. However, she had heard from her former housekeeper, who still worked for the new owner, that invitations had indeed been sent throughout the village. "But Jane, what do you make of it? It sounds positively macabre." Mrs. Bantry's voice carried a note of excitement barely masked by propriety. "Most unusual," Miss Marple agreed. "And you say Colonel and Mrs. Bantry never knew this Miss Blackwood before selling Gossington?" "Never heard of her. Apparently she purchased the house through an agent in London. Very wealthy, they say, though no one seems to know where the money comes from. She arrived just last week with only a lady's maid and a rather stern-faced butler. Hasn't ventured into the village at all?" Miss Marple listened attentively, sorting through each detail as one might sort through a basket of berries, looking for those that were overripe or suspicious. "And will you attend, Dolly?" "Oh, absolutely. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Besides, I'm rather curious to see what she's done with the place. Will you come with me?" Miss Marple agreed that she would, and after a few more minutes of speculation, they ended their call. She returned to her chair by the window, gazing out at her garden, while her mind worked steadily. By midday, the entire village was abuzz with talk of the peculiar invitation. Miss Marple's doorbell rang no fewer than 3 times, as neighbours came to compare notes and share theories. First was Miss Weatherby, a thin, nervous woman who taught piano to the village children. "It must be some sort of theatrical production," she insisted, "a murder mystery game, like those weekend events at country houses." Next came Mr. Harmon, the vicar, troubled by what he considered a most inappropriate joke. To make light of murder in such a way, and in our peaceful community, I've half a mind not to attend at all. Last was Dr. Haydock, who looked more intrigued than concerned. "Fascinating from a psychological perspective," he mused. "What would drive someone to announce their own murder? A cry for help, perhaps." Miss Marple listened to each visitor with the same attentive patience, offering tea and nodding at appropriate intervals. She volunteered little of her own thoughts, but absorbed every scrap of village gossip about the mysterious Letitia Blackwood. The time evening fell. She had pieced together a patchwork of information. Miss Blackwood was unmarried, somewhere in her 50s, had no known family, and had allegedly made her fortune through investments in South African diamond mines. Her lady's maid was French and aloof, while her butler, Mr. Graves, had been overheard speaking rather curtly to the local butcher's boy. As predicted, rain clouds had gathered by late afternoon, and a steady drizzle now tapped against Miss Marple's windows. She sat knitting by lamplight, her fingers moving automatically while her mind turned over the day's events. There was something familiar about this situation, something that reminded her of an incident many years ago involving old Mrs. Elbridge's grandniece, who had developed a flair for the dramatic after attending theatre school in London. That situation had ended with nothing more serious than a broken engagement and wounded pride. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that human nature remained remarkably consistent across time and circumstance. She set her knitting aside and glanced at the invitation once more. Whatever game Letitia Blackwood was playing, Miss Marple suspected it was more complex than a simple bid for attention. And in her experience, games involving murder had an unsettling tendency to become reality. Chapter 2. The Garden Party. Saturday arrived with the sort of perfect English summer weather that seems almost deliberately arranged for garden parties. Miss Marple dressed with particular care, selecting a floral print dress that, while not new, was perfectly respectable, and a hat she had trimmed herself with fresh ribbons. At 2:45, Dolly Bantry arrived in her little Austin to collect her friend. "What a crowd there'll be!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed as they drove toward Gossington Hall. "Everyone's talking about nothing else. The butcher told me he's delivered enough cold cuts to feed half the county. Has anyone actually met Miss Blackwood yet?" Miss Marple inquired, securing her hat as they rounded a corner. "Only Inspector Craddock, apparently. He called on her yesterday, unofficial visit, of course, but concerned about that ghastly invitation. Mrs. Ellison at the post office said he left looking quite perplexed. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Inspector Craddock was a sensible man who had consulted her, albeit reluctantly at first, on several previous cases. His concern suggested that Miss Blackwood had not been easily dismissed as merely eccentric. Gossington Hall came into view, its Georgian facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cars lined the driveway, and guests in their summer finery were already making their way across the immaculate lawn. "My goodness," breathed Mrs. Bantry as they approached. "She's had the entire garden redesigned. Arthur would have had a fit. He was so fond of those old roses." The garden indeed looked transformed. Gone were Colonel Bantry's beloved but somewhat haphazard rose beds, replaced by geometric patterns of low-box hedges and architectural plantings. A white marquee had been erected near the ornamental pond, and waiters in black ties circulated with trays of champagne. As they joined the throng of guests, Miss Marple observed the mixture of excitement and unease that permeated the gathering. Everyone was dressed in their best, yet their expressions betrayed a certain nervousness, as though unsure whether they were attending a celebration or something more sinister. "There she is," whispered Mrs. Bantry, discreetly indicating a tall woman standing near the terrace. Letitia Blackwood was not what Miss Marple had expected. Instead of the theatrical eccentric her invitation had suggested, she appeared remarkably composed. She was elegantly dressed in pale blue silk, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged in a sophisticated style. Her face, while handsome rather than pretty, showed intelligence in the keen dark eyes and firm mouth. She was speaking animatedly to Dr. Haydock, her hands gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point. "She doesn't look like someone expecting to be murdered in an hour," Mrs. Bantry observed dryly. "No," agreed Miss Marple, "but perhaps that's precisely the impression she wishes to give." They moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with neighbours. Miss Marple noted that Inspector Craddock was present, ostensibly enjoying the party, but positioned where he could keep a clear view of their hostess. He caught Miss Marple's eye briefly and gave a slight nod of acknowledgment. Eventually, they found themselves being introduced to Miss Blackwood herself. "Mrs. Bantry, how delightful to meet you at last!" she exclaimed, taking both of Dolly's hands in hers. "I do hope you don't mind the changes I've made. One must put one's own stamp on a place, mustn't one?" "Ah, of course," Mrs. Bantry replied with the graciousness of the well-bred. "And this is my dear friend, Miss Marple." Miss Marple, Letitia Blackwood, turned her penetrating gaze to the elderly lady. "I've heard quite a bit about you since arriving in St. Mary Mead. They say very little escapes your notice." "People are too kind," Miss Marple demurred. "I'm merely an interested observer of human nature." "Then we have that in common," said Miss Blackwood, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Human nature fascinates me as well, particularly its darker aspects." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a young woman who approached with obvious reluctance. "Ah, Miranda, there you are," Miss Blackwood said. "My niece, Miranda Shaw," she explained to her guests. "She's come to stay with me, though she finds country life terribly dull after London, don't you, dear?" Miranda Shaw was in her early 20s, with copper-coloured hair and a pretty face currently set in an expression of poorly concealed anxiety. She mumbled a greeting before being summoned away by a severe-looking man whom Miss Marple identified as Graves the butler. "You must excuse her," said Miss Blackwood. "She's rather highly strung. Now, do enjoy yourselves. The strawberry tarts are particularly good." As she moved away to greet other guests, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "I thought she had no family. Where did this niece suddenly appear from?" "Perhaps niece is being used in that loose way people sometimes do," Miss Marple suggested. "A goddaughter, or distant relation, perhaps." They wandered toward the refreshment table, where Miss Marple observed several interesting tableaux. The vicar's wife engaged in intense conversation with a distinguished gentleman she didn't recognize. Miranda Shaw, apparently arguing in hushed tones with a young man near the pond, and most curious of all, the French lady's maid watching the proceedings from a window in the house, her expression unreadable. As 4 o'clock approached, a palpable tension descended upon the gathering. Conversations grew quieter, and glances were increasingly directed toward watches and the ornate garden clock mounted on the terrace wall. At 5 minutes to 4, Inspector Craddock positioned himself closer to Miss Blackwood, who appeared to be enjoying the mounting suspense. She raised her champagne glass in a silent toast to him, a gesture he acknowledged with a tight smile. The garden clock began to chime the hour. 1, 2, 3, 4. The final chime seemed to hang in the air as the assembled guests held their collective breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a scream pierced the silence, not from anywhere near Miss Blackwood, who still stood smiling on the terrace, but from inside the house. "How theatrical," murmured Mrs. Bantry, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on Letitia Blackwood's face, which had drained of colour. This, Miss Marple was certain, was not part of any planned dramatics. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. Inspector Craddock was already moving toward the house, followed by Dr. Haydock. Miss Blackwood remained frozen in place, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the terrace stones. Within minutes, Graves appeared at the French doors, his professional composure visibly shaken. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice that trembled slightly, "I regret to inform you that there has been an incident. Inspector Craddock requests that all guests remain where they are for the moment." A murmur rippled through the crowd as speculation began immediately. Miss Marple, however, was watching Miss Blackwood, who had sunk into a nearby chair, her face ashen. "It would appear," Miss Marple said softly to Mrs. Bantry, "that someone has indeed been murdered at 4 o'clock, but I don't believe it was the person who expected to be." Chapter 3. The wrong victim chaos ensued as Inspector Craddock emerged from the house, his face grim. 2 constables arrived shortly thereafter, and the garden party that had begun with such elegance now resembled a disturbed ant-hill, guests clustering, in groups, whispering theories and expressing shock. "I must ask everyone to move to the drawing-room," Inspector Craddock announced, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs. "We'll need to take statements from each of you." As the crowd shuffled toward the house, Miss Marple noticed that Letitia Blackwood remained seated, seemingly frozen in place. Dr. Haydock was at her side, pressing a glass of water into her trembling hands. "Who is it?" Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple as they followed the others. "Who's been killed?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "I believe we shall find out soon enough." The drawing-room of Gossington Hall, once familiar to Miss Marple, from visits to the Bantrys, had been redecorated in a modern style that emphasised clean lines and muted colours. The guests perched uncomfortably on elegant but rather stiff furniture. The festive atmosphere of the garden party entirely evaporated. Inspector Craddock stood before the fireplace, flanked by one of his constables who was poised with a notebook. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I regret to inform you that a man has been found dead in the library. We are treating this as a suspicious death. I must ask that nobody leaves until we have taken your statements." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Miss Marple's eyes darted to Miss Blackwood, who had been escorted inside and now sat apart from the others, her face like marble. "Who was it?" called out Colonel Melchett, a local magistrate who had been engaged in boisterous conversation throughout the afternoon. "Not someone from the village, I hope?" "The deceased has been identified as Mr. Harold Symington, a solicitor from London," replied the inspector. "Did anyone here know him?" There was a moment of silence before Miranda Shaw let out a small cry. All eyes turned to her. He was my fiancé," she stammered. "He wasn't supposed to be here today. He told me he had business in London until tomorrow." Inspector Craddock's expression softened slightly. "I'm very sorry, Miss Shaw. We'll need to speak with you privately, of course." Miss Marple observed that while Miranda Shaw appeared genuinely distressed, Letitia Blackwood's reaction was more complex. Shock, certainly, but there was something else in her expression as well. Something that reminded Miss Marple of old Mrs. Ellington when she discovered her prize roses had been cut by the gardener's boy. As Inspector Craddock began organising the process of taking statements, Miss Marple found herself seated next to Dr. Haydock. "What happened, Doctor?" she asked quietly. Dr. Haydock glanced around before responding in a low voice. "Blunt force trauma to the head, from what I could see. Quite violent. He was found slumped over the desk in the library by one of the maids when she went to fetch more napkins. Been dead about half an hour when I examined him, which puts the time of death very close to 4 o'clock. The exact time Miss Blackwood predicted in her invitation," murmured Miss Marple. "Yes, rather unsettling, isn't it? The police are naturally very interested in that coincidence." They fell silent as Graves approached, offering tea with mechanical precision that belied the extraordinary circumstances. Miss Marple noticed that his hands were perfectly steady, despite the shock that had been evident on his face earlier. "Graves," she said gently as he poured, "you found the poor man, didn't you?" The butler's composure slipped momentarily. "No, miss. It was Berthe, the upstairs maid. But I was first to respond to her scream. Most distressing." "I imagine so. Have you met Mr. Symington before today?" "Once, madam. He visited Miss Blackwood briefly last Thursday. They spoke privately in the library." Miss Marple thanked him, filing away this information as the butler moved on to serve others. Across the room, Inspector Craddock was now speaking with Letitia Blackwood, whose colour had returned somewhat, though she still clutched a handkerchief tightly in one hand. Mrs. Bantry rejoined Miss Marple after giving her statement. "This is all quite dreadful," she whispered. "They're saying it must have been a burglary gone wrong. But who would break in during a garden party with dozens of witnesses?" "Unless," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "the garden party provided the perfect distraction. Everyone was outside at 4 o'clock, watching Miss Blackwood, expecting something. dramatic to happen. You don't think she arranged her own diversion, do you? That macabre invitation, it's too coincidental. I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that several people here today have not been entirely truthful. That young man by the window, for instance. She nodded discreetly toward a well-dressed man in his 30s, who stood somewhat apart from the others, nervously adjusting his cufflinks. Who is he? His name is Philip Durrant. I overheard him introduce himself to the vicar as an old friend of Miss Blackwood's from London. But did you notice how she barely acknowledged him when he arrived? And now he seems most anxious to leave. Their observations were interrupted as Inspector Craddock approached. Miss Marple, he said with a nod of greeting. Mrs. Bantry, I wonder if I might have a word. He led them to a quiet corner of the room. I understand you both arrived together, and have been in each other's company throughout the afternoon. They confirmed this was the case. Did either of you notice anything unusual? Anyone entering or leaving the house around 4 o'clock? Miss Marple considered. The French lady's maid was watching from an upstairs window shortly before 4, and Mr. Graves came out onto the terrace briefly, I believe, to check that everything was proceeding as planned. What about Miss Blackwood? Did she seem nervous or expectant as the time approached? She seemed to be enjoying the attention Mrs. Bantry offered, almost as if she were staging a dramatic moment. But when that scream came from the house, she looked genuinely shocked. I believe, Miss Marple added softly, that whatever Miss Blackwood expected to happen at 4 o'clock, it was not the murder of Mr. Symington. Inspector Craddock regarded her thoughtfully. Would you care to elaborate on that, Miss Marple? It's merely an impression, she demurred. But the invitation suggested that she herself would be the victim. One wonders why she would announce such a thing, unless she had reason to fear that someone might indeed wish her harm. A warning disguised as a macabre joke, suggested the inspector. Perhaps. Or a way of ensuring that when the time came, she would be surrounded by witnesses quite visibly alive and well. As darkness fell, the guests were finally permitted to leave, though not before providing their contact details. Miss Marple noticed that Miranda Shaw was escorted to a separate room, presumably for further questioning about her fiancé. As Mrs. Bantry drove them back through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, she sighed heavily. What a dreadful business! Poor Colonel Bantry would be turning in his grave. Murder at Gossington Hall, twice in our lifetime. Yes, agreed Miss Marple, her mind still working over the events of the day. And I fear, my dear, that there is more to come. This is only the beginning. Chapter 4. Village Voices. The morning after the garden party dawned grey and misty, as if St. Mary Mead itself were in mourning. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind turning over the events at Gossington Hall like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. She rose early and was tending to her begonias when the telephone rang. "Jane, it's Dolly. Have you heard the latest?" Miss Marple had not, but Mrs. Bantry was eager to share what she had learned from her former housekeeper, who still had connections among the Gossington Hall staff. "They say the police were there until midnight. That poor girl, Miranda, was quite hysterical by the end. They had to call Dr. Haydock back to give her a sedative. And the most curious thing, the French maid has disappeared." Disappeared? Miss Marple's interest sharpened, packed her things and left sometime during the night. Inspector Craddock has put out an alert for her. They're saying she may have seen something or been involved. After promising to meet for tea later, Miss Marple replaced the receiver and considered this new development. A fleeing servant was always significant in her experience, but whether as perpetrator or frightened witness remained to be seen. Her morning shopping provided further village intelligence. At the butcher's, she learned that Miranda Shaw had been seen arguing with her fiancé in the village tea shop 2 days before the murder. At the bakery, Miss Weatherby was expounding her theory that Miss Blackwood must surely be involved, for who else would benefit from such a terrible crime? By noon, Miss Marple had completed a circuit of the village and collected a tapestry of opinions, suspicions, and half-truths. She was carefully sorting through these as she tended her garden when the garden gate creaked open. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you." It was Inspector Craddock, looking tired but determined. She invited him in for tea, and once they two were settled in her small sitting room, he came directly to the point. "I value your insights, Miss Marple. You have a way of seeing what others miss." He paused, weighing his words. "This business at Gossington Hall, it's more complex than it appears." "Murder usually is," she replied gently. "The facts as we know them are these. Harold Symington, aged 37, solicitor with Preston and Hargreaves in London, found dead in the library at approximately 4 o'clock. Cause of death, blunt force trauma from a heavy bronze paperweight. No signs of a struggle, nothing stolen, no forced entry." And his connection to Gossington Hall? Officially, none. He was not invited to the garden party. According to Miss Shaw, he told her he would be in Manchester on business yesterday, yet he was found in evening dress, as if attending the party, though no one recalls seeing him among the guests. Miss Marple considered this, and his relationship with Miss Shaw. Engaged for 3 months. She claims they were very happy, though. Several witnesses now report seeing them argue recently. The inspector sighed. Miss Blackwood has been most cooperative, though clearly shocked. She maintains she had never met Symington before last Thursday, when he came to discuss some legal matters regarding her late uncle's estate. "I see. And has the missing maid been found?" Inspector Craddock looked surprised. "News travels fast. No, Mademoiselle Dupont remains missing. Her room was left in perfect order, nothing disturbed. Rather like Marie-Helene, the parlour-maid at Lady Trumpington's who disappeared after the silver was found missing," Miss Marple mused. "Though in that case it turned out she had eloped with the gardener's boy and left precisely because she feared being accused of the theft." The inspector smiled faintly. "You think our maid may have fled not out of guilt, but fear?" "It would be consistent with human nature, wouldn't it? Especially a foreign young woman in a strange country, suddenly finding herself in the midst of a murder investigation." After the inspector left, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage for her weekly meeting with the Women's Institute. The gathering was predictably dominated by discussion of the murder, with Mrs. Price Ridley declaring that foreigners always bring trouble, and Miss Weatherby insisting that the whole affair had a distinctly theatrical quality. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, but her ears pricked up when Mrs. Cray, who cleaned for Dr. Haydock twice weekly, mentioned that the doctor had been called to Gossington Hall early yesterday morning before the garden party. Miss Blackwood was taken poorly, they said. Something she ate, most likely. The doctor gave her something to settle her stomach. said she was determined not to cancel her party. This small detail troubled Miss Marple as she walked home. If Miss Blackwood had truly feared for her life, enough to announce her own murder as a form of protection, why insist on proceeding with the party when she was already unwell? She was turning this over when she noticed a figure ahead on the lane. Philip Durrant, the nervous man from the garden party, now knocking at her garden gate. "Miss Marple," he called, spotting her. "Might I have a word? It's rather important." She invited him in, noting his agitated manner, and the way his fingers drummed continuously against his leg as they sat in her parlour. "I understand you're something of a... well, that is to say, you notice things. The inspector speaks highly of you." "Inspector Craddock is too kind," she demurred. "The thing is," Durrant lowered his voice, though they were quite alone, "I don't believe Letitia is safe. That invitation, announcing her own murder, it wasn't a joke or a game. She was genuinely afraid. You knew Miss Blackwood well before yesterday." "We were colleagues at the British Museum years ago. I'm a manuscript curator now, but we've kept in touch. When she inherited Gossington Hall from her uncle, she wrote to me about strange things happening. Items moved in the night, footsteps when she was alone, a sense of being watched." "Did she have any specific suspicions?" "Only that it might be connected to her uncle's death. Old Mr. Blackwood died in peculiar circumstances, a fall down the stairs at his London home. The police investigated, but found nothing suspicious." Durrant hesitated. "Letitia believed someone pushed him, and that she might be next." Miss Marple poured more tea as she digested this. "And why would anyone wish harm to either Mr. Blackwood or his niece? Money, of course. The old man was wealthy, and Letitia inherited everything. There was another potential heir, a nephew, I believe, who contested the will but lost. Letitia never mentioned his name. She only referred to him as my cousin's boy, and said he was always trouble." As Durrant left, promising to return if he recalled anything else of significance, Miss Marple found herself with more questions than answers. She was still pondering these when Mrs. Bantry arrived for tea, full of fresh news. They found the maid in a boarding house in Much Benham, of all places. And Jane, she claimed she saw someone enter the library shortly before 4 o'clock. Someone she didn't recognise. A man in a dark suit with a red flower in his buttonhole. "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And did many of the gentlemen wear buttonholes yesterday?" "Several did. It was a garden party after all. I recall Colonel Melchett sporting a rather gaudy carnation, and that nervous fellow Durrant had a rosebud, I believe." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, he did, and he's just been here, expressing concern for Miss Blackwood's safety. It seems her uncle died in questionable circumstances some months ago." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Do you think the two deaths are connected?" "I think," said Miss Marple, carefully, "that we are dealing with a situation where nothing is quite as it appears, and that makes it very dangerous indeed." Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following day brought rain, steady and persistent, transforming the lanes of St. Mary Mead into glistening ribbons. Miss Marple sat by her window, ostensibly engaged in knitting a complicated pattern for a baby's shawl, but her mind was occupied with the tangled web surrounding the death at Gossington Hall. She was startled from her reverie by a knock at the door. It was Martha, her faithful maid, announcing that Miss Shaw was outside, looking rather desperate and thoroughly soaked. "Show her in at once, Martha, and bring some towels and hot tea." Miranda Shaw looked considerably worse than when Miss Marple had last seen her at the garden party. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her copper hair hanging in damp tendrils, and she clutched her sodden coat around herself like armour. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I didn't know where else to go. The police keep asking me the same questions, and I just can't bear to stay at Gossington any longer." Once the young woman was settled with tea and had dried her hair, she seemed marginally calmer. "Why did you come to me, Miss Shaw?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Aunt Letitia, Miss Blackwood, mentioned that you help people sometimes, that you understand things others don't." Her hands trembled as she set down her teacup. "And I'm afraid, Miss Marple, I'm very afraid." "Of whom, my dear? I don't know. That's what's so terrible. Harry is dead, and I can't understand why anyone would want to harm him. He was just a solicitor, not involved in anything dangerous. And now the police look at me as if I might have done it." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "You were heard arguing with Mr. Symington recently." Miranda flushed. "It was nothing serious, just a disagreement about wedding plans. Harry wanted something grand in London. I preferred something simpler, here in the country." She twisted the engagement ring on her finger. "He could be stubborn sometimes, but he always came around in the end." "I see. And your relationship with Miss Blackwood? She is your aunt, you said." "Not by blood. She was my mother's dearest friend at school. And when Mother died 10 years ago, Aunt Letitia kept in touch. She's been very kind to me." Miranda hesitated. "Though I must admit, I was surprised when she invited me to stay at Gossington. We hadn't seen each other in several years. And when did you arrive?" "Last Tuesday, just 3 days before the garden party." Miranda's expression clouded. "That's another thing the police keep asking about. Why Harry came to see Aunt Letitia last Thursday, when I was visiting friends in the village. He never mentioned it to me." Miss Marple noted this with interest. "Were you aware that your aunt was feeling unwell on the morning of the garden party?" "Oh, yes. She was dreadfully sick at breakfast. I thought she might cancel everything. But by noon she seemed much better." Miranda frowned. "How did you know about that?" "Village gossip," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "Very little remains. Secret in St. Mary Mead." Their conversation was interrupted by the telephone ringing. It was Inspector Craddock, asking if he might call on Miss Marple later that afternoon. Upon hearing that Miranda Shaw was already there, he asked to speak with her. "Yes, Inspector. I understand." "No, of course not." "I'll come directly," Miranda said, her face growing increasingly pale. She hung up and turned to Miss Marple. "I have to go back to Gossington Hall. They've found something in Harry's pocket, something they want me to identify." After Miranda had left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her thoughts were interrupted by another visitor. This time Dr. Haydock, ostensibly calling to check on her rheumatism, but clearly eager to discuss the case. "Most peculiar business," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Miss Blackwood came to me quite distraught this morning. She's convinced someone tried to poison her before the garden party." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "Did you find any evidence of that when you treated her?" "Nothing conclusive. The symptoms could have been food poisoning or a simple gastric upset, but she insisted I take samples of the morning's coffee for testing. He shook his head, said she tasted something bitter and feared someone had put something in it. And who might have had the opportunity? That's just it. Several people. The butler, the maid, even Miss Shaw was apparently at breakfast with her. And now, with Symington's murder. He trailed off. You think the two might be connected? It seems too coincidental otherwise. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. There's something else. When I examined Symington's body, I noticed unusual marks on his fingers. Stains of some sort. Could be ink, as he was a solicitor, but they didn't look quite right for that. More like chemical staining. This detail lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after Dr. Haydock had left. She was still considering its significance when Inspector Craddock arrived in the late afternoon. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, as he settled into the chair she offered. "But there have been developments I thought you should know about." He explained that they had found a torn piece of paper in Symington's pocket with what appeared to be the beginning of a will. Just the standard opening. I, Letitia Eleanor Blackwood, being of sound mind. And then it's torn off. The inspector frowned. Miss Shaw identified it as her aunt's handwriting, though she seemed quite shocked by it. Was Mr. Symington Miss Blackwood's solicitor? No, that's the puzzling thing. Her affairs are handled by a firm in London, Weatherby and Sons. Symington had no professional connection to her that we can establish. Miss Marple considered this, and yet he visited her privately, in legal capacity it seems, just days before. The garden party. Exactly. Inspector Craddock looked troubled. Miss Blackwood claims she consulted him about a minor property matter related to her uncle's estate, but we have no record of any such transaction. And what does Miss Blackwood say about this fragment of her will? She denies writing it recently, says it must be from years ago. But the paper appears new, and Miss Shaw was quite certain it was her aunt's current handwriting. After the inspector left, Miss Marple decided a walk might help clarify her thoughts. Despite the drizzling rain, she put on her mackintosh and boots and set out toward the village. As she passed the post office, Mrs. Ellison beckoned her inside, eager to share that she had seen Philip Durrant at the telephone box that morning, talking most urgently to someone, looking over his shoulder the whole time as if he feared being overheard. Near the church, Miss Marple encountered the vicar's wife, who mentioned that Miranda Shaw had been asking about trains to London, acting most peculiarly, as if she might bolt at any moment. But it was her chance meeting with Graves, Miss Blackwood's butler. That proved most enlightening. He was hurrying out of the chemist's with a small package, looking harried. "Good afternoon, Mr. Graves," Miss Marple greeted him. He started visibly. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. Such dreadful weather, isn't it? I hope Miss Blackwood is recovering from her shock." "She is resting," he replied stiffly. "If you'll excuse me, I must return to Gossington." As he hurried away, Miss Marple glanced into the chemist's shop, where Mr. Ellis was watching from the window with a concerned expression. "Poor fellow," Mr. Ellis said when she entered. "That's the third time this week he's been in for sleeping powders for Miss Blackwood. Says she hasn't slept properly since moving to Gossington. Can't say I blame her now, with murder in the house." Miss Marple walked home slowly. turning over everything she had learned. Something was nagging at the edge of her consciousness. A detail observed but not yet processed, like a loose thread in her knitting that would unravel the pattern if pulled correctly. It came to her as she reached her garden gate. The stains on Symington's fingers that Dr. Haydock had mentioned. They reminded her of something very specific, something she had seen many years ago on the hands of her nephew Raymond when he was experimenting with photography as a young man. And suddenly, several seemingly disconnected elements of the case began to align themselves in a new and disturbing pattern. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The next morning, Miss Marple woke with a sense of purpose. She had sent a telegram to her nephew Raymond the previous evening, requesting information about chemical photography processes, and was now awaiting his reply. In the meantime, she had another line of inquiry to pursue. After breakfast, she telephoned Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, I wonder if you might accompany me to Gossington Hall today. I feel I should pay a condolence call to Miss Blackwood, and it would be less awkward with you there, having been the previous owner." "Of course, Jane, though I must warn you, people are saying she's in quite a state. Barely leaves her room, according to my sources." An hour later, they were driving through the gates of Gossington. The house looked subdued under the grey sky, its windows like watchful eyes. Graves received them with professional detachment, and informed them that Miss Blackwood was indeed indisposed, but that Miss Shaw would be happy to receive them. Miranda looked marginally better than the day before, though there was still a haunted quality to her expression. She led them to the drawing-room, which felt chilly despite the fire burning in the grate. "Aunt Letitia is resting," she explained. "The doctor gave her something to help her sleep. These past few days have been difficult." "Of course, my dear," Mrs. Bantry said sympathetically. "Such a shock for everyone." Miss Marple observed the room carefully, as Mrs. Bantry made polite conversation. Her attention was drawn to a collection of photographs on a side table. Miss Blackwood in various locations around the world, many featuring archaeological sites. "Your aunt appears to have travelled extensively," she commented. "Oh, yes," Miranda brightened slightly. "She worked in archaeological preservation for years. That's how she met my mother. They were both working on a dig in Egypt in the 1960s. Aunt Letitia has quite an eye for detail, and was particularly skilled at photographic documentation." "How interesting. Was she still involved in that work recently?" "Actively, though she maintains connections with several museums. She was corresponding with the British Museum about some artefacts from her uncle's collection just last month." "With Mr. Durrant, perhaps?" Miss Marple asked innocently. A flicker of something. Surprise? Concern? Crossed Miranda's face. "Yes, I believe so. How did you know?" "He mentioned they were former colleagues when we spoke." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who looked surprised to find visitors. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, I hadn't expected to see you here today. Just a social call," Mrs. Bantry explained smoothly. "To see how everyone is bearing up under these dreadful circumstances." The inspector nodded but seemed distracted. "Miss Shaw, there's been a development. We've located Mr. Symington's briefcase in a ditch about a mile from here. I'd like you to look through its contents, see if you recognize anything." Miranda paled, but agreed to accompany him to the library. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry exchanged glances, silently deciding to follow at a discreet distance. In the library, now cleared of police tape, but still bearing an atmosphere of tragedy, a battered leather briefcase lay open on the desk, where Symington had met his end. Inside were legal papers, a diary, and several photographs. "These appear to be surveillance photographs," Inspector Craddock said, laying them out. "Professional quality. Do you recognize the subjects?" Miranda gasped. The images showed Miss Blackwood at various locations around the village, all clearly taken without her knowledge. Another set showed Miranda herself, walking with Symington in what appeared to be a London park. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would Harry have these?" The inspector's expression remained neutral. "I was hoping you might tell me." From the doorway, Miss Marple studied the photographs with keen interest. Their quality confirmed her suspicions about the stains on Symington's fingers, chemicals used in developing photographs. As Miranda struggled to respond to the inspector's questions, they were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Philip Durrant burst in, looking agitated. "I must speak with Letitia immediately. Is she here?" "Mr. Durrant," Inspector Craddock said firmly, "this is an active investigation area. I must ask you to—" "You don't understand," Durrant interrupted. "I've just received word from the museum. The documents Letitia was inquiring about, the ones relating to her uncle's Egyptian collection, they've been confirmed as forgeries. High-quality forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless." A tense silence followed this announcement. Miss Marple exchanged a significant look with Mrs. Bantry. "What relevance does this have to our murder investigation?" Inspector Craddock asked. Durrant ran a hand through his hair. "Letitia's uncle, Edmund Blackwood, was rumoured to have acquired certain artefacts through questionable channels during his time in Egypt. Nothing was ever proven, but there were whispers. If someone was creating forged documentation for these items, they might be attempting to legitimize illegally obtained antiquities," Miss Marple finished softly. All eyes turned to her. "Exactly," Durrant confirmed. "It's a serious crime with international implications." The telephone in the hall rang. Serendig. Graves appeared a moment later. "For you, Inspector. Scotland Yard. They say it's urgent." While Inspector Craddock took the call, Miranda moved closer to Durrant, speaking in a low, urgent voice that Miss Marple strained to hear. "Philip, you promised not to involve the museum directly. Aunt Letitia was handling it privately." "That was before a man was murdered in her library," he replied tensely. "Everything's changed now." Their hushed conversation was cut short when Inspector Craddock returned, his expression grave. "The French maid, Mademoiselle Dupont, has been found dead in her boarding house in Much Benham. Initial evidence suggests poisoning." A collective gasp filled the room. Miranda swayed slightly, and Mrs. Bantry guided her to a chair. "When?" Durrant demanded. "The landlady found her this morning, but the doctor estimates she died sometime last night." The inspector turned to Miranda. "Miss Shaw, is your aunt capable of receiving visitors? I need to speak with her immediately." I don't think so. The doctor said she shouldn't be disturbed." "I'm afraid this can't wait." As Inspector Craddock moved toward the door, Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. "Inspector, before you speak with Miss Blackwood, there's something you should know about those photographs." "Yes, Miss Marple?" "The work is quite distinctive. I believe it matches a style I've seen before, in Miss Blackwood's travel documentation." The composition, the focus on architectural detail in the background of even casual shots. It's rather particular. The inspector frowned. You're suggesting Miss Blackwood took surveillance photos of herself? Not necessarily herself, but someone. With her training, certainly. Miss Marple hesitated, then added, Has anyone established precisely where Mr. Symington was staying before his death? He wasn't local after all. We assumed he was commuting from London, Inspector Craddock admitted. His office claimed he was on leave, and his apartment concierge said he'd been away for several days. At that moment, Graves appeared in the doorway, his composed facade finally cracking. Inspector, I believe you should come quickly. Miss Blackwood's room, it's empty, and there are signs of a struggle. As chaos erupted around her, Miss Marple remained still, mentally adjusting the pattern of her understanding like stitches in her knitting. The connections were becoming clearer, but the complete picture remained just out of reach, a crucial strand still missing from the intricate design. Chapter 7. Another twist. Inspector Craddock immediately organised a search of the house and grounds. Miss Blackwood's bedroom revealed few clues beyond an overturned chair and a shattered water glass. The French windows stood ajar, though Graves insisted they had been locked the previous evening. This could be an abduction, the inspector said grimly, or Miss Blackwood may have staged her own disappearance. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to observe from the doorway, noted the room's details with her customary thoroughness. The bed was rumpled but not slept in. A book lay open on the nightstand, a bookmark neatly placed between pages. The medicine bottle prescribed by Dr. Haydock stood nearby, half empty. Her walking shoes are missing, Miranda said, checking the wardrobe, and her small leather handbag. As the search expanded beyond the house, Miss Marple drew Mrs. Bantry aside. I believe we should pay a visit to the village post office, she murmured. There's something I need to verify. They slipped away while the police were occupied, driving back to St. Mary Mead in relative silence. At the post office, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Ellison with a carefully composed expression. I wonder if you might help me with a small matter, she began. Do you recall if Miss Blackwood received any telegrams recently? Or sent any? Mrs. Ellison looked thoughtful. She received one yesterday morning, delivered to Gossington by young Tom. As for sending, no, though Miss Shaw did send one to London the day before the garden party. Most urgent, she said it was. Miss Marple thanked her, and they continued to her cottage, where they found a telegram from Raymond waiting. Mrs. Bantry watched curiously as Miss Marple read it. Anything helpful? Indeed, Raymond confirms that certain photographic chemicals can leave distinctive staining on the fingers, particularly silver nitrate, which turns the skin black. It's commonly used in developing certain types of photographs. She folded the telegram carefully. Dolly, I believe we should return to Gossington. There's something in the library I need to examine more closely. Upon their return, they found the search still underway. Police constables combed the gardens, while Inspector Craddock interviewed the household staff in the drawing room. Philip Durrant paced the terrace, smoking nervously. Miss Marple made her way to the library, which was momentarily unoccupied. She moved directly to the bookshelves, examining them with focused attention. After several minutes, she gave a small nod of satisfaction and was about to leave when Miranda Shaw entered. Miss Marple, What are you doing in here?" "Just browsing, my dear. Your aunt has quite an impressive collection on Egyptian archaeology." Miranda's expression tightened. "The police have finished questioning me for now. They keep asking about my relationship with Harry, as if—" Her voice caught. "As if I had something to do with his death, and the telegram you sent to London," Miss Marple said gently. "Was that to Mr. Symington?" The young woman stiffened. "How did you know about that?" "Mrs. Ellison mentioned it. Village post offices are remarkable repositories of information." After a moment's hesitation, Miranda nodded. "Yes, I sent a telegram to Harry. Aunt Letitia had been acting strangely, saying she felt threatened. I was worried about her." "And yet you didn't tell the police this." Miranda looked away. "It's complicated. Harry's presence here, Mitchith, wasn't supposed to happen like this." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion outside. Through the window, they could see several police officers converging on the ornamental pond at the far end of the garden. They hurried outside to find Inspector Craddock standing at the pond's edge, where a constable was retrieving something from the murky water with a long pole. "What is it?" Mrs. Bantry asked, joining them. "A handbag," the inspector replied grimly. "Appears to match the description of Miss Blackwood's missing bag." The leather handbag, sodden and stained, was carefully opened. Inside were a handkerchief embroidered with the initials LB, a small amount of money, and a folded piece of paper protected from the water by a plastic sleeve. Inspector Craddock examined it. "It's a letter, addressed to Miss Blackwood from a JR at the British Museum, dated 2 weeks ago." He skimmed the contents. "It concerns authentication of documentation for the Amenhotep pieces, and suggests a meeting with their expert on Egyptian provenance documentation." Philip Durrant, who had joined the group, let out a low whistle. "The Amenhotep collection. Those are the disputed artifacts. Edmund Blackwood claimed to have discovered them at a minor excavation site in 1948, but there were always questions about their origin." A constable approached from the direction of the village. "Sir, we've had reports of a woman matching Miss Blackwood's description seen walking toward Danebury Downs early this morning. Local farmer says she appeared to be in a hurry." "That's nearly 5 miles from here," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Surely Letitia couldn't have walked so far in her condition." "Unless she had transportation waiting," suggested Miss Marple quietly. The discovery of the handbag led to renewed search efforts concentrated around the Downs. Miss Marple, claiming fatigue, asked Mrs. Bantry to drive her home. Once there, however, she made a telephone call to Inspector Craddock. "Inspector, there's something I believe you should know. The books in Miss Blackwood's library, specifically. The ones on Egyptian archaeology. Several have dedication inscriptions to Edmund Blackwood from a J. Symington, dated in the late 1940s. J. Symington. Any relation to our victim, Harold Symington? I suspect so. The handwriting has similar characteristics to the fragment of will found in Harold Symington's pocket." She hesitated. "Inspector, I believe we should speak with Miss Shaw again, with particular attention to her family connections." By early evening, Miss Marple was knitting by lamplight when her telephone rang. It was Inspector Craddock. "You were right to direct our attention to family connections," he said without preamble. "We've established that Harold Symington was the son of Jonathan Symington, who worked with Edmund Blackwood in Egypt. Jonathan died 20 years ago, but his papers included letters suggesting a dispute over ownership of certain artifacts. Edwth C., said Miss Marple thoughtfully. And has Miss Blackwood been found? Not yet, but we've discovered something else. The French maid, Mademoiselle Dupont, wasn't French at all. Her real name was Ellen Smith, a known accomplice of an art forger, convicted 3 years ago. He paused. And Miss Shaw has disappeared. Disappeared? Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her knitting. She went upstairs to rest about an hour ago. When Graves went to call her for dinner, her room was empty. Her suitcase and personal items are gone. After finishing the call, Miss Marple sat motionless, her mind working steadily. The pattern was taking shape now. The seemingly disparate threads coming together in a design that, while still incomplete, was beginning to make sense. She reached for her address book and dialed another number. Dr. Haydock, I wonder if I might ask you about those stains you observed on Mr. Symington's fingers. Did they look precisely like photographic chemicals, or could they have been something else? Something perhaps used in document forgery. The doctor's answer seemed to confirm something in her mind. She thanked him and replaced the receiver, her expression grave. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to revisit certain assumptions about the case, beginning with the very first one. Who, exactly, had been expected to die at 4 o'clock on the day of the garden party? Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test morning brought a persistent drizzle to St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple was up early, making preparations with the methodical precision that characterized all her activities. She carefully packed a small basket with certain items from her kitchen, then telephoned Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, I need your assistance again today. Could you drive me to that small cottage on Danebury Downs, the one that used to belong to the Forestry Commission?" "The old gamekeeper's cottage? It's been empty for years." Mrs. Bantry sounded puzzled. "Whatever do you want there?" "I believe it may not be as empty as we think," Miss Marple replied. "But we should inform Inspector Craddock first. Would you telephone him while I finish getting ready?" An hour later, Mrs. Bantry's Austin bumped along the narrow track leading toward the Downs. Inspector Craddock followed in a police car, his expression sceptical when Miss Marple had explained her theory. "I don't see how you've connected Miss Blackwood to this particular cottage," he had said. "We've had officers searching the entire area since yesterday." "The Downs cover considerable ground, Inspector," Miss Marple had replied, "and this cottage is quite well hidden among the trees. Besides, I believe Miss Blackwood would know of it. Colonel Bantry once mentioned that Edmund Blackwood used it occasionally when visiting Gossington, for bird-watching, he claimed, though the colonel suspected it had more to do with meeting a lady friend discreetly. Now, as they approached the weathered stone building nestled in a small copse, Miss Marple noted the faintest wisp of smoke from the chimney, quickly dispersed by the rain. "Someone's there," Mrs. Bantry whispered. Inspector Craddock signalled to his constable to circle around to the back of the cottage while he approached the front door, hand near his coat pocket where, Miss Marple knew, he carried a small revolver. Before he could knock, however, the door swung open. Letitia Blackwood stood in the doorway, looking tired but composed, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. "I thought you might find me eventually," she said calmly. though I must admit I didn't expect it quite so soon. You'd better come in out of the rain." The cottage interior was Spartan but neat. A small fire burned in the grate, and a kettle steamed on a camp stove. There was no sign of Miranda Shaw. "The gun is just a precaution," Miss Blackwood said, setting it carefully against the wall. "I've been rather nervous, as you might imagine. We've been concerned for your safety, Miss Blackwood," Inspector Craddock said carefully. "There are 2 murder victims connected to your household." "Yes, poor Harry. And Ellen, though I never knew her as anything but Berta." She sank into a chair. "I suppose you want explanations?" "That would be helpful," the inspector agreed. Miss Blackwood looked at Miss Marple with a weary smile. "Though I suspect you've worked much of it out already, haven't you?" "Some aspects," Miss Marple admitted, "though not all the particulars." "Began with my uncle's collection," Miss Blackwood said. "Edmund acquired certain artefacts during his time in Egypt, some through official channels, others less so. After his death, I discovered documentation suggesting that several of his most valuable pieces had been obtained illegally. The Amenhotep collection," Inspector Craddock prompted. "Yes. I was in the process of quietly arranging their return to Egypt when I began receiving threatening notes. Someone knew about the questionable provenance and was demanding money to keep silent." She looked down at her hands. "Then I found a listening device in my London flat. Someone had been monitoring my conversations." "So you decided to retreat to Gossington Hall," Miss Marple suggested. "I thought I would be safer in a small village where everyone knows everyone else's business. Ironic, isn't it?" She gave a humourless laugh. "But they followed me here. First Ellen, posing as a French maid to spy on me, and then Harry Symington." "Harold Symington was blackmailing you?" Inspector Craddock asked. "Not initially." "At first I had no idea who he was. He approached me as a solicitor specializing in international art law. It was only later I discovered he was Jonathan Symington's son." She sighed. "Jonathan had legitimate claims to some of Edmund's collection. They had worked as partners for years, but they had a falling out, and Edmund took full credit and ownership. And Harold Symington discovered this connection. He found his father's papers after his mother died last year. That's when he began investigating, eventually tracking me to Gossington." She looked at Miss Marple. "I suspect you've already deduced the rest. Mr. Symington wasn't just seeking legal redress," Miss Marple said quietly. "He was also engaged to your niece, Miranda Shaw." "Who isn't actually your niece at all, is she?" Inspector Craddock interjected. Miss Blackwood shook her head. "No. Miranda is Jonathan Symington's daughter from his second marriage, Harry's half-sister. They planned it together. She would ingratiate herself with me, posing as my old friend's daughter, while Harry built a legal case regarding the artefacts. But something went wrong," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Everything went wrong." Miss Blackwood's composure finally cracked. Miranda started having doubts. She and I developed a genuine friendship, and she began to question their methods. Then someone tried to poison me the morning of the garden party. "You suspected Miranda?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "No, Ellen, the so-called French maid. I caught her searching my study the night before. I confronted her, and she admitted working for a third party interested in the artefacts, but she denied any poisoning attempt. Miss Blackwood's hands twisted in her lap. I believed her. Strangely enough, she seemed genuinely frightened. Which is why you sent out those peculiar invitations, Miss Marple said. You feared for your life, but didn't know exactly who to fear. Precisely. I thought a public declaration might deter any attempt, or at least ensure I was surrounded by witnesses. At the critical time, she looked at Inspector Craddock. I never imagined Harry would be killed instead. Do you know who killed him? The inspector asked directly. No. Miss Blackwood's answer was firm. I was on the terrace when it happened, visible to everyone, but after Ellen was found dead too, I feared I might be next, or that I would be blamed. So I fled. And Miranda? She came to me here yesterday, terrified. She swore she had nothing to do with either death, that she and Harry had genuinely fallen in love, and their plan had evolved from simple legal action to actual blackmail only recently. Miss Blackwood hesitated. She left last night, heading for London. She was afraid to stay. Miss Marple had been silent, her bright eyes taking in every detail of Miss Blackwood's demeanour. Now she spoke again. There's still something you haven't told us, isn't there, about Philip Durrant? A flicker of surprise crossed Miss Blackwood's face. Philip? He's an old colleague, that's all. Who has been remarkably well informed about your uncle's collection, Miss Marple noted, and who appeared most concerned about the forged documentation. He works at the museum, Miss Blackwood said defensively. Naturally, he would be concerned about potential forgeries. Yes, agreed Miss Marple, though one wonders why a manuscript curator would be quite so knowledgeable about Egyptian artifacts. A tense silence followed this observation. Inspector Craddock glanced between the two women, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully comprehend. Miss Blackwood, Miss Marple said gently, I've brought something that might interest you. She reached into her basket and withdrew a small jar. This is a special silver polish I make myself, using an old family recipe. It's particularly effective at removing certain types of stains from the hands, like those that might result from working with silver nitrate. Miss Blackwood stared at the jar, her expression unreadable. You see, Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone, I couldn't help noticing your hands when we first met at the garden party. They were immaculate, unusually so for someone who supposedly worked extensively with photographic chemicals in her archaeological career. I don't understand what you're suggesting, Miss Blackwood said stiffly. I think you do. Miss Marple placed the jar on the small table between them. Mr. Symington's hands, by contrast, bore the distinctive staining of someone who had recently worked with such chemicals. Dr. Haydock confirmed as much. Inspector Craddock leaned forward, attention sharpened. What exactly are you saying, Miss Marple? I'm saying, she replied, that the narrative we've been presented requires careful re-examination. And I believe Miss Blackwood knows precisely why. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The silence in the cottage stretched taut as a wire. Rain pattered against the windows, and the fire crackled in the grate, but no one spoke. Miss Blackwood stared at the small jar of silver polish, her face pale but composed. I think, she said finally, that you are making unwarranted assumptions, Miss Marple. Am I? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Let us consider the facts as we know them. Harold Symington was found dead in your library at precisely 4 o'clock, the very time you had announced you would be murdered. He had chemical stains on his fingers consistent with photographic development or, as Dr. Haydock suggested, document forgery. Inspector Craddock shifted in his seat. You believe Symington was forging documents related to the artifacts? That would be a reasonable conclusion, Miss Marple agreed. But there's more. The torn will fragment found in his pocket, supposedly in Miss Blackwood's handwriting, suggests he was involved in some form of legal deception as well. He was attempting to forge my signature, Miss Blackwood interjected, to create a new will, most likely. That's why I confronted him that Thursday before the garden party. Ah, but that's where the timeline becomes problematic, Miss Marple said. You see, according to Graves, who is remarkably observant for a butler, Symington visited you on Thursday. Yet Miranda sent a telegram to him the day before the garden party, which would have been Friday. Why would she need to send him a telegram if he was already in the area? Miss Blackwood's composure faltered slightly. Perhaps she didn't know he was still here. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, the man who visited you on Thursday and the man found dead in your library were not the same person at all. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Not the same person? But surely, consider, Miss Marple continued, that very few people in St. Mary Mead had ever met Harold Symington before. Miranda identified the body, of course, but she had every reason to maintain the deception if she was involved. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. What are you saying, Miss Marple? I'm suggesting that the man who died in the library might have been someone else entirely, someone whose death needed to be disguised as Harold Symington's. She turned her clear gaze to Miss Blackwood. Someone like Jonathan Symington, perhaps. The colour drained completely from Miss Blackwood's face. Jonathan is dead. He died 20 years ago. Did he? Miss Marple asked softly. Or did he merely disappear, only to resurface when his son discovered those papers? Papers that might have revealed some very uncomfortable truths about the Amenhotep collection. The inspector looked bewildered. This is speculation, Miss Marple. Jonathan Symington was declared dead years ago. Yes, and Edmund Blackwood inherited his share of their joint discoveries, Miss Marple noted. Most convenient. A sound from outside interrupted them, the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window, they could see another car approaching. Philip Durrant emerged, followed by Miranda Shaw. Miss Blackwood's hand moved instinctively toward the shotgun, but Inspector Craddock was quicker, placing himself between her and the weapon. I think we should hear what they have to say, he said firmly. When Durrant and Miranda entered, the small cottage became crowded. Miranda looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed. She started at the sight of Miss Blackwood, but seemed even more surprised to see Miss Marple. You were supposed to be on your way to London, Miss Blackwood said accusingly. I couldn't leave, Miranda replied, not with everything unresolved. She glanced at Durrant. Philip convinced me to go to the police, but when we arrived at the station, they told us Inspector Craddock had come here. With good reason, the inspector said. Miss Blackwood has been sharing some interesting information about her uncle's collection and your family's connection to it. Durrant moved closer to Miranda, his manner protective. What exactly have you told them, Letitia? Nothing that wasn't already becoming apparent, Miss Blackwood replied wearily. They know about the artifacts, about Miranda and Harry's relationship, about Jonathan's claims. But not everything, Miss Marple interjected softly. Not the real reason for that peculiar invitation announcing a murder that was indeed planned, but not yours, Miss Blackwood. All eyes turned to her. I've been puzzling over that invitation since the beginning, Miss Marple continued. It seemed unnecessarily theatrical if your only concern was personal safety. But what if it served another purpose entirely? What if it was designed to establish, publicly and irrefutably, that a specific person died at a specific time? She looked at Miranda. The man in your aunt's library wasn't Harold Symington, was he? Miranda's face crumpled. Harry's alive, she whispered. It was his father, Jonathan Symington, who died. Miranda, Durrant warned. No, Philip, I can't keep lying. She turned to Inspector Craddock. Jonathan Symington didn't die 20 years ago. He disappeared, yes, but he resurfaced last year after Harry found those papers. He'd been living under another name in South Africa. And the plan? Miss Marple prompted gently. It was supposed to be simple, Miranda said, her voice breaking. Jonathan would approach Aunt Letitia as Harry, using his son's credentials as a solicitor. They looked very similar. He would negotiate for recognition of his contribution to the collection, maybe some financial compensation. But it became more complicated, Miss Marple suggested. Jonathan was dying, Miranda admitted. Cancer, advanced. He had months at most. When he learned about the questionable provenance of some pieces, he saw an opportunity for one final score, blackmail, which Miss Blackwood would not agree to, Miss Marple concluded. I refused, Miss Blackwood confirmed. I was already arranging to return the questionable items. I wouldn't be blackmailed over something I was voluntarily addressing. So Jonathan threatened exposure, Inspector Craddock said, of both the illegal acquisitions and your uncle's betrayal of his partner. Yes, he gave me a deadline, the Saturday of the garden party, 4 o'clock. Miss Blackwood's voice was steady now. That's when I conceived my plan. The invitation would establish that I expected something to happen at that exact time. I would be visibly elsewhere, surrounded by witnesses, while Jonathan met with someone in the library. Miss Marple finished. Someone who killed him and made it appear that Harold Symington had been murdered. A heavy silence fell. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she continued her work, seemingly relaxed despite the tension in the room. The question remains, she said after a moment. Who killed Jonathan Symington? And who killed the maid, Ellen Smith? Miranda shook her head desperately. It wasn't me. I swear it wasn't. I was with Mrs. Bantry when the scream came from the house. And I was on the terrace, Miss Blackwood added. Everyone saw me. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. You were both quite visible at the crucial moment, as was Mr. Durrant, standing near the rose garden with his distinctive buttonhole. She looked directly at him, though the maid described seeing a man with a red flower enter the library, didn't she? Durrant's expression remained neutral. Detail anyone at the party could have observed and reported. True, Miss Marple conceded. But there's something else that's been troubling me. Miss Blackwood referred to Ellen Smith by her real name just now, yet, according to Inspector Craddock, her true identity was only discovered after her death. How did you know who she really was, Miss Blackwood? The atmosphere in the cottage shifted perceptibly as this inconsistency registered with everyone present. Miss Blackwood faltered. I learned it from the police. No, Inspector Craddock said slowly. I never told you her real name. Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed something she had long suspected. I believe, she said quietly, that we are now approaching the truth of what happened at Gossington Hall. Chapter 10. The Truth Unravelled. The cottage had grown uncomfortably warm, yet Miss Blackwood seemed to shiver. Outside the rain continued to fall, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, it would be best if you told us the complete truth now, Miss Blackwood. Miss Blackwood looked from face to face, then sighed deeply. Very well, but it's not quite as Miss Marple suggests. She straightened her shoulders. I did know Ellen Smith was not really French. I discovered it the night before the garden party when I caught her searching my study. She admitted working for someone else, but wouldn't say who. And you didn't report this to the police? Inspector Craddock asked. I was going to, after I dealt with Jonathan Symington. Miss Blackwood's voice hardened. Yes, the man in the library was Jonathan, not Harry. But I did not kill him. Then who did? The inspector pressed. I don't know, she insisted. I arranged for him to be in the library at 4 o'clock. Yes, I wanted him contained, away from the other guests while I contacted the proper authorities about his blackmail attempt. The invitation was meant to establish my whereabouts and provide witnesses to my innocence. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic movement. Yet someone knew of this arrangement. Someone who took advantage of it to eliminate Jonathan Symington. Miranda, who had been listening intently, suddenly turned to Philip Durrant. You knew, she said accusingly. You knew it was Jonathan who died, not Harry. You've known all along. Durrant's face remained impassive. I suspected, he admitted. The man I glimpsed at Gossington that Thursday didn't quite match the photographs of Harold Symington I'd seen in the museum's personnel files when researching the case. The case? Inspector Craddock echoed. Philip isn't just a manuscript. Curator, Miranda explained. He's been working with the International Art Recovery Division, investigating the provenance of disputed artifacts, including the Amenhotep collection. I see, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. So when Miss Blackwood began making inquiries about returning certain items, it caught your attention, Mr. Durrant? He nodded. We'd had suspicions about Edmund Blackwood's collection for years, but could never prove anything. When Letitia inherited and then started asking questions about documentation, it seemed the perfect opportunity to resolve the case. Yet you didn't identify yourself officially to Miss Blackwood, Inspector Craddock noted. Standard procedure in ongoing investigations, Durrant replied. We needed to determine if she was complicit in her uncle's illegal acquisitions, or merely an innocent inheritor. Miss Marple turned to Miss Blackwood. And Ellen Smith? How did she fit into all this? A shadow crossed Miss Blackwood's face. I didn't kill her either, if that's what you're asking. After the murder, when the police began investigating, I feared she might implicate me in Jonathan's death. Make it appear I had arranged not just his presence in the library, but his murder as well. So you fled, Inspector Craddock concluded. Yes, I came here to think, to plan my next move. She hesitated. I did visit Ellen at her boarding house the night she died. I wanted to know who she was working for, whether they were connected to Jonathan. She refused to tell me, but she seemed frightened. When I heard she'd been poisoned—" "You feared you would be next," Miss Marple finished for her. "Or blamed for her death as well," Miss Blackwood admitted. Inspector Craddock looked troubled. "This still doesn't tell us who killed either of them. I think," said Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, "that we should look more closely at the timing of events. The garden party was scheduled for 3 o'clock. The murder was announced to happen, at 4. Yet Dr. Haydock estimated that Jonathan Symington died around 3:30. 3:30, Miranda repeated. "But that's impossible. The scream didn't come until 4. "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded, "which suggests that whoever killed him had to ensure the body wasn't discovered until the appointed time. They needed the murder to appear to have happened exactly when Miss Blackwood's invitation predicted." "But why?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "If the victim wasn't Miss Blackwood, after all, why maintain that fiction?" "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "the invitation served 2 purposes. It established Miss Blackwood's alibi, yes, but it also ensured that everyone's attention would be focused on her at precisely 4 o'clock, leaving the real killer free to act elsewhere." She turned to Miranda. "You said Harry is still alive. Where is he now?" Miranda paled. I don't know exactly. He was supposed to come to London after everything was settled with his father. And the plan was for Jonathan to die of his cancer, presumably after securing some form of compensation," Miss Marple pressed, "with Harold then legally inheriting any settlement as his son." "Something like that," Miranda admitted, "though I swear I never agreed to blackmail. Neither did Harry. That was all Jonathan's idea." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you, my dear, but let us consider Ellen Smith's role more carefully. She was posing as a French maid, spying on Miss Blackwood. Yet she claimed to have seen someone enter the library shortly before 4 o'clock. Someone with a red flower in his buttonhole, like Mr. Durrant was wearing," Inspector Craddock noted. "And several other gentlemen," Miss Marple added. "But why mention this detail specifically, unless it was meant to direct attention toward a particular suspect?" She looked at Durrant. "Were you acquainted with Ellen Smith previously, Mr. Durrant? Through your work investigating art forgeries, perhaps?" Durrant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "She was a potential informant in another case. I didn't expect to find her at Gossington." "Yet you made no mention of this connection," Miss Marple observed. "It wasn't relevant," he said defensively, "and might have compromised other investigations." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you feared she might reveal something about your true purpose at Gossington Hall, something beyond official investigative duties." The atmosphere in the cottage grew tense as all eyes focused on Durrant. He remained outwardly calm, but Miss Marple noted a slight tick in his jaw. "You're making unsubstantiated accusations, Miss Marple," he said coolly. "Am I?" She turned to Miss Blackwood. "When did you first meet Philip Durrant, Miss Blackwood? Was it truly years ago at the British Museum, as he claimed?" Miss Blackwood's brow furrowed. "Yes, though we were never particularly close colleagues. I was surprised when he reappeared after all this time, claiming friendly concern. And did you ever discuss the Amenhotep collection with him specifically? Before recent events, I mean." "No," Miss Blackwood said slowly. "I don't believe I did." Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed something. "Inspector, I think you might find it worthwhile to investigate Mr. Durrant's connections more thoroughly, particularly any relationship he might have had with Edmund Blackwood or Jonathan Symington in the past." Durrant's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. I came here to help resolve this situation, not to be accused of what exactly? You still haven't specified what crime you're attributing to me." "No," Miss Marple agreed calmly. "I haven't, but I think we're very close now to understanding exactly what happened at Gossington Hall, and why." She looked meaningfully at Inspector Craddock. "And I believe the final piece of this puzzle may be found in Harold Symington's current whereabouts." The Inspector nodded slowly, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "Miss Shaw," he said, turning to Miranda, "I think it's time you tell us precisely where Harold Symington is hiding, and when you last communicated with him." Chapter 11. The Final Pieces. Miranda Shaw's composure, which had been gradually crumbling throughout the conversation, finally collapsed entirely. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. "I don't know where Harry is," she sobbed. "That's the truth. He was supposed to contact me once he reached London, but I haven't heard from him since the morning of the garden party. That's why I'm so frightened. What if something has happened to him too?" Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "The telegram you sent him the day before the garden party, what did it say?" Miranda looked up, tears streaking her face. "I warned him that something felt wrong. Aunt Letitia had sent out those invitations, and I'd overheard her arguing with his father. I was afraid their plan was falling apart." "And did Harold respond?" Inspector Craddock asked. "He telephoned that evening. He said he would come early to the garden party before the other guests to speak with his father." She shook her head miserably. "But I never saw him. And then everything happened so quickly." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "Events at Gossington seemed to unfold with remarkable speed, almost as if they were being directed." Philip Durrant, who had been silent since Miss Marple's suggestion to investigate his past connections, shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm observing that this entire affair has been characterized by careful timing and theatrical elements," she replied calmly. "The invitation announcing a murder. The body discovered at precisely 4 o'clock. The planned confusion over identities." She picked up her knitting again. "It reminds me rather of a production my nephew once directed. A mystery play where the audience was deliberately misled about which character had been murdered until the final act." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Are you suggesting this whole situation was staged?" "To a degree," Miss Marple nodded, "though the deaths were tragically real. But I believe the circumstances were manipulated to obscure the true motive." She turned to Miss Blackwood. "Your invitation served its purpose admirably. It established your alibi while ensuring everyone's attention was focused on you at the critical moment." "But I've already admitted that," Miss Blackwood said impatiently. "Yes, I wanted witnesses to my whereabouts when Jonathan was in the library, but I didn't arrange his murder." "Perhaps not directly," Miss Marple conceded, "but let us consider the sequence of events more carefully. Jonathan Symington, posing as his son Harold, visited you on Thursday to discuss his blackmail demands. You refused, but suggested he come to the garden party on Saturday to continue negotiations, specifically that he wait in the library at 4 o'clock. Miss Blackwood nodded reluctantly. Meanwhile, you sent out invitations announcing your own murder at that precise time, ensuring that all eyes would be on you at the crucial moment. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. A clever arrangement. But there's one element I'm still curious about. Who suggested the 4 o'clock timing initially? Was it your idea, or Jonathan's? Miss Blackwood frowned. I don't recall. Exactly. I believe I suggested he come to the garden party and he specified the time. How interesting, Miss Marple mused, almost as if he wanted to be in the library at that specific hour. And who else knew of this arrangement? No one, Miss Blackwood insisted. At least no one from me. Though I suppose he might have told Miranda or Harold. I knew nothing about it, Miranda protested. Harry just said his father was meeting with Aunt Letitia during the party. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And the poison attempt the morning of the garden party, that seems an odd coincidence, doesn't it? Almost as if someone wanted to ensure you would be visibly unwell, necessitating Dr. Haydock's visit, yet recovered enough to proceed with the party. Are you suggesting I poisoned myself? Miss Blackwood asked incredulously. Not necessarily, Miss Marple replied, but the timing is suggestive. It provided additional witnesses to your condition that morning, reinforcing your position as a potential victim rather than a perpetrator. She turned to Inspector Craddock. I believe we should consider another possibility that has been overlooked. What if Harold Symington is indeed dead, but not in the way we've assumed? A puzzled silence followed this statement. I don't understand, Mrs. Bantry said. Miss Shaw just told us Harold is alive. She believes he is, Miss Marple corrected gently. But consider, no one in this room has actually seen or spoken to Harold Symington since the morning of the A garden party. Miranda received a telephone call supposedly from him the night before, but telephones can be deceptive, and the body in the library was identified as Harold by Miranda, who had every reason to maintain the fiction that it was Jonathan who died. Miranda stared at Miss Marple, colour draining from her face. No, that's not possible. It was Jonathan, in the library. I saw him. I recognized him. Did you? Miss Marple asked softly. Father and son, who strongly resembled each other, one of whom you hadn't seen in years. In the shock of the moment, with a body already identified to you as Jonathan, might you not have seen what you expected to see? But the plan, Miranda began, then stopped abruptly. Yes, the plan, Miss Marple nodded. That's the critical element, isn't it? A plan that would allow Jonathan Symington, dying of cancer, to secure compensation for past wrongs while ensuring his son would inherit. But what if someone modified that plan for their own purposes? All eyes turned to Philip Durrant, who remained outwardly calm, though his hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly. This is pure speculation, he said dismissively. You have no evidence for any of these claims. Perhaps not definitive evidence, Inspector Craddock admitted, but enough questions to warrant further investigation. He turned to Miranda. We need to establish Harold Symington's whereabouts conclusively. You mentioned he was supposed to contact you in London. Where specifically? At whose residence? Before Miranda could answer, A commotion outside interrupted them. A police car had arrived, and a constable was hurrying toward the cottage, radio in hand. "Inspector," he called as he entered, "we've had news from London. They've found Harold Symington." The atmosphere in the cottage seemed to freeze. "Where?" Inspector Craddock asked. "In a hotel in Bloomsbury, sir. Registered under the name John Smith." The constable hesitated. "He's alive, but unconscious. Appears to be an overdose of sleeping medication. They've taken him to hospital." Miranda gave a small cry of relief, but Miss Marple's expression remained grave. "And when did this occur?" she asked. "The hotel maid found him this morning," the constable reported, "but the doctor estimates he's been unconscious since yesterday evening, so he couldn't have been the one who killed Ellen Smith." Inspector Craddock concluded. "She died late last night." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I think we may now be approaching the truth about what happened at Gossington Hall, and why." She looked directly at Philip Durrant, a truth that has less to do with blackmail over Egyptian artefacts, and more to do with a very old and personal grievance. "Isn't that right, Mr. Durrant?" Philip Durrant's face was a mask, but something flickered in his eyes, something cold and calculating that made Miss Marple think of Colonel Bantry's description of certain men he had known during the war. Men, he had said, who could kill without batting an eye and sleep soundly afterward. "I think," Durrant said quietly, "that this conversation has gone far enough without legal representation." Miss Marple nodded, as if his response had confirmed something important. "Yes," she agreed, "I believe it has." Chapter 12. Aftermath. 3 days later, Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine that had finally emerged after the rain. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the air. Mrs. Bantry arrived with a basket of fresh strawberries and settled into the chair opposite. "Well, Jane," she said, pouring tea, "you were right as usual. It's all over the village now. Philip Durrant has confessed to both murders." "Yes," Miss Marple nodded. "Inspector Craddock telephoned this morning. The evidence was quite conclusive once they knew where to look." "But I still don't understand the whole story," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "Why would a respected museum curator commit such dreadful crimes? The inspector mentioned something about an old connection to the Symingtons, but he was rather vague on details." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "It goes back many years. Philip Durrant was not his original name, you see. He was born Philip Blackwood, Edmund Blackwood's son from a brief early marriage that ended in divorce." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Edmund's son? But that would make him Letitia Blackwood's cousin," Miss Marple confirmed, though she had no idea of the connection. Edmund Blackwood apparently never acknowledged the boy, and his mother remarried when he was very young, giving him his stepfather's name of Durrant. So he was the cousin's boy Letitia mentioned to Mr. Durrant, without realizing she was speaking to him directly, the one who contested the will. Precisely. Philip Durrant grew up knowing he had been disinherited and replaced by his father's niece as heir. As he told Inspector Craddock after his arrest, he spent years carefully working his way into a position at the British Museum where he could monitor his father's activities, particularly regarding the Egyptian artefacts. And all that time he was planning revenge, Mrs. Bantry asked. "Not initially, perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. But when Jonathan Symington resurfaced last year with potential evidence of Edmund Blackwood's unethical acquisitions, Durrant saw an opportunity. As an investigator for the International Art Recovery Division, which he was legitimately, he had been keeping files on both the Blackwood collection and Jonathan Symington's claims for years. So he approached the Symingtons with some sort of plan? Yes. He encouraged Jonathan and Harold to pursue their claim against Letitia, but with a modification to their original approach. Instead of Jonathan posing as Harold for a straightforward legal discussion, Durrant suggested a more elaborate scheme involving blackmail, the falsification of documentation, and ultimately the staged murder that would be announced in advance. Mrs. Bantry frowned. But how did he convince them to go along with something so bizarre? Jonathan was dying and bitter about his treatment by Edmund Blackwood years ago. Harold was devoted to his father and angry on his behalf, and Miranda, who genuinely cared for Harold, was persuaded it was a way to secure justice without actual violence. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. They didn't realize that Durrant had a much darker purpose in mind. She explained how Durrant had manipulated events, first by establishing a relationship with Letitia Blackwood under the guise of an old colleague, then by secretly encouraging her to send out the peculiar invitations after learning of Jonathan's blackmail attempt. He even arranged for the mild poisoning the morning of the garden party. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make her ill temporarily and ensure Dr. Haydock would be called, reinforcing the impression that she was a potential victim rather than a perpetrator. But his actual target was Harold Symington all along? Mrs. Bantry asked. Yes. Durrant had learned that if anything happened to Letitia, a significant portion of the Blackwood estate, including valuable artifacts not under scrutiny for their provenance, would go to distant relatives. By eliminating both Jonathan and Harold Symington, who had legitimate claims to part of the collection, and then framing Letitia for their murders, he stood to gain control of everything once his true identity was revealed. But he didn't succeed in killing Harold, Mrs. Bantry noted. No, he drugged Harold on the morning of the garden party, then lured Jonathan to the library half an hour before the appointed time, killing him with the bronze paperweight. He deliberately left the body to be discovered at 4 o'clock when all attention would be on Letitia. Miss Marple sighed. His plan might have worked if not for one overlooked detail. The French maid, Mrs. Bantry guessed. Ellen Smith, yes. She wasn't just spying for Durrant, as he later claimed. She was actually working with Harold Symington, keeping watch over his father. She saw Durrant enter the library before the appointed time and became suspicious. When she later realized the dead man was Jonathan, not Harold, as was being claimed, she understood what had happened. So Durrant had to silence her, yes. After sending Harold to London with a forged note supposedly from Miranda, Durrant tracked Ellen to her boarding house and poisoned her. But by then, too many inconsistencies had accumulated. The timing of the murder, the chemical stains on the victim's hands that didn't match his supposed profession, the convenient discovery of surveillance photographs that would implicate Letitia. "And you put it all together," Mrs. Bantry said, admiringly. Miss Marple shook her head modestly. "It reminded me of something that happened years ago at the Village Amateur Dramatic Society. The director was always changing things at the last minute, creating confusion that served to hide his misappropriation of the society's funds. This case had that same quality of deliberate misdirection. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a robin hop along the garden path. "And what will happen to Miss Blackwood now?" Mrs. Bantry asked eventually. "She'll need to address the questions about her uncle's collection, of course, but Inspector Craddock believes she was genuinely unaware of their problematic provenance until recently. Her actions in attempting to return the items will count in her favour, and Miranda and Harold. Harold is recovering well. The hospital expects to release him next week. Whether he and Miranda will continue their relationship remains to be seen. She was deceived by Durrant as well, believing she was helping to secure justice for Harold's father rather than participating in an elaborate plot." Miss Marple sighed. "Though I suspect she knew more than she initially admitted about the plan to substitute Jonathan for Harold at Gossington Hall." As the afternoon waned toward evening, Mrs. Bantry gathered her things to leave. At the garden gate she paused. "It's curious, isn't it, Jane? All those lives damaged by old resentments and hidden connections. And none of it would have come to light if not for that peculiar invitation." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Miss Blackwood thought she was being clever by announcing a murder that would never happen, while Durrant counted on everyone assuming the murder was the one that had been announced. Neither anticipated that the real mystery would be unravelled by the very attention they'd drawn to it." She looked out over her garden, where shadows were beginning to lengthen across the lawn. "Human nature remains remarkably consistent, Dolly. We all create stories to justify our actions, but the truth has a way of asserting itself eventually. Just as these roses will bloom according to their nature, regardless of how we might wish to direct them." Mrs. Bantry smiled. "Until next time, Jane. Though I do hope the next excitement in St. Mary Mead doesn't involve quite so many deaths." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I fear that wherever human passions run deep, tragedy often follows." She closed her garden gate quietly, returning to the peace of her roses as the church clock struck 6, marking the end of another day in St. Mary Mead. A day when, for once, no murder had been announced.